Thank you very much for this lovely introduction, Julie, and it's really great for me to come back to SPARCS. I had the chance to participate already in 2 SPARCS meetings, and it's really good to come back, and thank you very much for inviting not just me, but also the Family Dog Project, and what it's really important for us to be always part of this initiative, because this is what we also love to do, to not just doing the science part, but also to put out our results and explain it to dog people. What they should do with dogs and how they should engage with them, and also if they have questions, we try to help them partly by our research. However, today I had another task for this conference, is to, as Janice Bradley was telling me, giving the big picture, so giving the background of the knowledge, what we know about dog domestication and what we think about dog domestication, and how maybe not just in theory but also in practice we can learn about how dogs were domesticated and what led to this unique relationship with humans that I'm happy to call usually friendship, which is actually quite extraordinary. And I often read, or people say that this is the specific relationship with an animal that no other human-animal relationship can replace. So, well, how should we start? And before we start, I think I should just tell you that really all the research that is done with the Family Dog Project, it's I think important to understand that it's not just my work, but actually a work of a lot of people. And I'm just showing you here one part of our group back from 2015, where we gathered. So you can imagine that there are 20-30 people, postdoc students, who are working on that project. Now, what is the real question for us today? Well, the question is how dogs were domesticated. And I know, and I'm sure that even there may be some geneticists watching, and maybe we'll hear something about geneticists later about this topic, and also archaeologists and so on. But from ethologists, so somebody who is working on animal behavior, I think these questions are rather simple. Nevertheless, I try to explain you in a simple way, and maybe then, of course, by time it gets more complicated. So the idea is obviously what we have to understand is that here we are dealing with an evolutionary process, and evolution is based on the change of genes, change of genetic factors, and this is what is important in biology, because sometimes evolution is used in a very different way. In addition, I think when we are talking about dog domestication, we also have to understand the domestication, although it's a relatively short process, it's also an evolutionary process. And as I will come back in this talk to the same idea repeatedly, basically we have here 3 levels of this process. You can say about different time scales. Domestication could be described as happening on a time scale from or between 10,000 to 30,000 years. If you are reading some papers on that, you might get the feeling that some people are debating whether it was 15,000, whether it was 12,000, whether it was 35,000. I, as an ethologist, would say, doesn't matter, who cares? I mean, this is such a long time that these things happen. And we know that genetics changes can actually occur sometimes on a much shorter scale. So all these debates are very important maybe for science being accurate, but rather for us, I think the time frame from 10 to 30,000 is just okay. Now we have obviously another time frame. This is what we are actually more familiar with when we are looking about at a dog breed, and this is the breed selection. So when breeds were selected. Obviously, during this long time, there were several periods where different dog breeds were selected, but actually most of the breeds that we have now today have been selected in a few hundred years. Even if you are looking at some very dedicated people, they can design or select for a new breed within 50 or 100 years. So this would be enough to actually make already a change among different dog breeds. And then obviously we have individual genetic variation, which means that dogs are different individually, not just by their look, but also by their behavior, and a lot of it actually comes from genetic differences. So this is the 3 levels we would like to investigate in our research. About the first levels, about domestication, I think this is the most simple picture that I can draw for you to understand what's actually going on. And here I think domestication is a little bit special in comparison to the evolution of a species, because what we have here is it starts usually with an ancient wolf population, then these populations diverge actually how other species might emerge in evolution. So eventually you have today now a recent wolf population, you have a recent dog population with a relative small genetic divergence. However, what is also happening is this continuous interaction at a relative low frequency that makes genes flowing from dogs to wolves and back from wolves to dogs. So this makes this whole situation obviously a little bit more complicated to work on, but nevertheless, even today we can say, and I would like to argue and usually argue, that dogs are quite different from wolves despite this low frequency gene exchange between the two species. Obviously what we have to take in account that why this divergence happened, the central cause for that was the presence of humans, actually ancient humans, which we don't really have any contact anymore, so we don't know how and why they affected these dog populations, but nevertheless this is the important environmental factor that made this divergence. Led to this divergence. So if you want to summarize this, what happens in domestication in a general way, then this is the time scale. So we are now here at present. This is the few 100 years maybe for the emergence of the breeds that we know at present, and this is the long time scale for the domestication, for which we have some genetic and some archaeological evidence as well. So you can say dogs were domesticated many years ago, that's fine. And we have also to understand that this domestication process actually happened in a very active and developing human population. So humans domesticated dogs at different parts of the world. They made trading with these animals. So it was not a classical evolutionary scenario that happened with the dogs many years ago. And also we have to note, and we know it from other experiments, that selecting for tame behavior, which is a very important part of the domesticated trait in general, I think it's very easy. So you don't need a long time. So all this long time that we have, was not necessarily needed for the dogs to emerge. And what is again very important, that humans during this time changed also a lot. So we know that human populations have changed, their activities have changed, they use the dog in different ways in different cultures. And I think this is part also of the story. Now, if you want it in a picture way, you can have it like that. So you have the wolves, and then the first step was, by the way, probably to select for or domesticate for a general dog population. At the beginning, there was no special need for having breeds, but obviously, it could be that there were breeds relatively early, but we can't just find it out from the archaeological or genetic evidence. So the assumption is at the moment that we have a general dog population, and then after many, many years, maybe at some point on the human history at different countries, different continents, they were breeds that they were emerging, and these became very much specific and dependent on human in a very different way, and changed, and it's very important, changed in different form and different ways, both in terms of shape, in terms of stimulation, and in terms of behavior. So just to go short over these changes, because I think it's important to realize that here we are talking about a general dog and a general wolf. So we compare wolves and dogs in this way. And obviously there are always exceptions to the rule, but there are, I think, biological facts that really discriminate the wolf and the dog. And this is why I rather consider them as two species rather than one, as stated or defined by others. So here for this, we have a general wolf, an average wolf, which is obviously not existing, and an average dog that is also not existing. But nevertheless, biologists like to understand this whole relationship in this terms of rules. So the first question is, what are the changes from the body or the shape And what you can see here, these changes are actually very simple. Size of the dog is generally, getting smaller. The head of a dog is generally getting smaller. If you look in a mouth of a wolf or a dog, if you have the chance to do that, probably it's not a good idea, but generally what you would find is that the teeth are smaller in the dogs. They're also more crowded, so they are not so nicely put together like what you would find in a wolf's mouth. And obviously this means that the whole body conformation is less strongly built. Wolves are usually considered as much stronger. And what may be surprising for some people, that even the brains of the dogs are much smaller. Obviously, this is a very slippery thing, because some might argue, because of this difference, that smaller brain might be related to some changes in their cognitive skills, in their behavior abilities. But we should take into account that this is not such strong rules, and I think generally dogs might be just an exception here, that they have indeed a smaller brain size, but their cognitive abilities might just be different from the wolves, rather than being at a different scale. And obviously what is also clear even from these pictures, that the colors of the fur is changed, not just the color, but also sometimes the quality of the fur, which is probably also the result of domestication differences. If we go to the stimulation, how these animals can be stimulated, what kind of changes occur there, then the first thing which is most important, especially from the behavior perspective, is the change in the sensitive period. The sensitive period for socialization is relatively short in the wolves. We don't really know exactly from where they are, how long it is. Usually we assume it's about 4 weeks up to the first month of the age, maybe a little bit longer, but for sure the socialization period is much longer in the case of the dog. At least it goes up to the 8th week, may sometimes up to the 12th week. So dogs could be socialized for much longer in comparison to the wolf, which I think is very important, because this way the human can enter the social world of the dog. We have a lot of time for doing that if we have the puppy. On the other hand, it's very important that we do that, otherwise the puppy might not be socialized to us. So this period is very important to take it seriously, because this is the fundamental time when the dog-human relationship or the owner-dog relationship is established and gets started. Obviously, part of that interaction is the change is that dogs are more sensitive to social cues rather than to food or other important incentives. So we can train a dog, we can just have a dog based on this social contact. For them, being with a human, getting rewarded with a human by his interaction, it's more important for a dog in comparison to the wolf. And obviously this is probably based, as I might show you later, on the difference how dogs might show a sensitive preference for the human. So even a dog puppy, in comparison to the wolf puppy, is actually preferring a human compared to another dog. And finally, the behavior that we can obviously see, there's also many changes that occurred during the domestication. For example, which is quite obvious, one change is even a non-dog owner would know that the main characteristic of a dog is whether it's barking or not barking, and obviously all dogs bark by definition, which is obviously not true. But however, barking is a very specific behavior that you see in the wolves you see in the dogs compared to the wolves. But also there are other behavior differences. So for example, regurgitation. So this is typically how parents of wolves feed their cubs after a certain age. Or the male wolf is still showing parental behavior toward the youngs, which actually we don't really have anymore in the dog. And there are many other differences. For example, what we call retrieval of objects. So dogs really like, most of them, especially as young animals, to retrieve objects, to play with objects, which is not so typical in the wolves. And this, in some breeds, is actually retained in the older age and becomes part of the interaction. between the human and the dog, what then is then changed or ritualized into play, for example, in many situations. And obviously another pattern of behavior is this, what is we call looking at the human. I mean, this really seems to be very natural and nothing new, but if you just interact with a wolf, even with a wolf puppy and with a dog puppy, you will soon realize this big difference, that the dog has a preference or is sort of pushed into interact with human in this way, which obviously you can train a wolf to look in the eyes of a human, but it's a different story. Okay, when I was preparing for this discussion or this presentation, I often read papers, and actually I'm still reading papers where people are talking about this dog-human relationship in an evolutionary perspective as being the result of a co-evolutionary process. Now, really, I tried to write about this so much, and I decided now to present you again this story. Maybe for some it's already quite boring, but I really have to do because this idea keeps to coming back all the time. And I think we really have to clarify it, that what coevolution means in biology and how we should talk about that in the dog-human relationship. So first of all, I think it's always good to have some definition. Here we have the definition for evolution. I mentioned it already. This is about This is about changing gene frequencies within one species, and this is how we can imagine how phenotypic changes or changes in look and behavior might come to surface. Now, coevolution means basically that two species evolve together, so the evolution, the gene changes take place actually in both species. So one change in one species has an effect on the genetic change in the other species. This is what we call coevolution. And here is a very nice example for that, when you consider the interaction between a predator and the prey species. So newts protect themselves by producing different toxins that actually are not killing, but necessarily are very unnatural for a greater snake. So the greater snake, in order to be able to feed on the newts, they are evolving new abilities to resist these toxins. Now, as a response, these animals evolve new toxins in order to fight against the greater snakes. And we know that this goes on for many 100,000, probably millions of years. So here we really see that genetic change in one species affects the genetic change directly in another species. Now, the problem is obviously, how can we then use the coevolutionary concept of the dog-human relationship? Well, we could, but there's no evidence for it. So the same logic doesn't apply. So okay, we could assume that dogs had undergone some genetic changes in the domestication or in their evolution. However, so far we have no evidence that this has affected in any way genetic change, specific genetic change in humans. Although humans have changed during this time, but we can't attribute that to the interaction with dogs. So unfortunately, although it seems to be so lovely to talk about this co-evolution of dogs and humans, at the moment we don't really have evidence for that. So we just should forget about that. If you really want to say something about dog-humans in terms of evolution, I think you would say that dogs and humans evolved in parallel. Both species evolved in some ways living by each other, but it's very unlikely that they affected each other's genetic makeup. Okay, well, now I'm a paleontologist, and if I'm looking for species differences, really what I should do is comparing them. Without comparison, really can't find out anything, even about a single species. To find out anything without comparison, it's actually problematic. So comparison, however, is difficult, especially if you are investigating evolutionary questions, because we have the problem that behavior is not fossilizing, so we can't go back in time. We have to work only with those animals that are alive at the time of our research. So in comparison to archaeologists who can still compare the bones of ancient wolves, ancient dogs, maybe to the recent specimens, we can't do that. So we can only work with wolves and dogs that are alive. We can observe them, and this is where we can compare obviously two species to find out something about the ancient situations and also find out about the differences that occur between dogs and humans. However, dogs and wolves. However, what is important here, that when you are doing behavior experiments, you need to make sure that the comparison is fair. You can't just compare a wolf that is running outside in the wild with a dog that is used to being in a flat, and then face them with the same experimental problem. So the only way to compare them is to give them, as puppies or young animals, the same experience, social experience, and also to allow them to interact in the same way with its environment where they will be tested. Now, the other issue is that obviously one dog, and comparing one dog and one wolf, that is also not very helpful. So you really need to have a large population for this comparison, otherwise that whole comparison could be quite questionable. Now, with the dogs, it's not so problematic because, as you know, I mean, there are hundreds of millions of dogs around. There are very lot of friends, people who are really happy to get engaged in the experiments and help us to do these observations. But what we do with the wolves? It's not so easy, especially in many countries. Wolves are protected still, and so it's not easy to get a hand on them. And however, this will be a difficult task to have a good population of wolves that can be tested. So basically the comparative approach that I will then introduce to you will have three levels as we started at the beginning. The first would be the comparing dogs and wolves that I just explained, which we are looking for differences between those two species and how these differences came to light and what are the quantitative, sometimes maybe qualitative differences between dogs and wolves. The second level of comparison will be the breed, comparing breeds. So this is another interesting questions because there are so many stereotypes. I always, when people talk to me, I hear this, that this breed is like that, other breeds is like that, and people consider breeds as being very specific, well-determined group of animals that, and I think this is a bit of a mistake. And partly this comes from, it originates from the fact that breeds are selected for their look. So really there's a lot of effort going into the direction that they should look similar, I mean each individual. But this is usually not happening with the behavior. So even within a breed that looks very much the same, there could be large differences in their behavior traits. And we will have a look at this as well. And obviously there's an individual variation. That means that even within breeds, you have very different individuals, despite they look could be quite similar. Okay, so yes, the first topic about dog-wolf comparison. Luckily, we had, during the history of modern dog behavior research, two groups who were very much engaged in wolf-oriented research. One group was actually the Family Dog Project, which at this time we could call Family Wolf Project, which I wouldn't really name officially because you should not keep a wolf at home. This is specific for research purposes. We had to get specific permissions for this, and so on and so forth. So wolf is not for being a pet. Wolf is still should be considered as a wild animal, and even wolf hybrids are not a good idea to have around the home. So I think if people would like to have a nice animal relationship, just would stick with the dogs. They will give enough problems if you are going for that direction, I'm sure. So the family in our project, really, you can see we raise these wolves, we socialize them just as if they would be dogs. We gave them all the possibilities to interact with an environment, to interact with the humans, and this was important because otherwise it's still difficult to compare two species. And in more recent time, another project emerged in Austria, which is called the Wolf Science Center. You can see here the two main researchers led by Kurt Korteschal and Sophie and Friederike, and they have a huge place where they keep the wolves under very nice conditions. Many, I think 2 or 3 packs of them are living there, and they can do a lot of very nice comparative research, especially because they also have dogs kept under very similar conditions, so they can compare the two species in a very nice way. However, I would focus I will have some examples from Ross Research Group, just so you can see how dogs and wolf actually differ in some specific way. Now, here's the first experiment that we done many years ago to find out whether there's a difference in a wolf puppy compared to a dog puppy when it's interacting with a human and a dog. Now, what is critical in this experiment is that the puppy has a choice, usually, between a dog that is trained to behave in a very calm way and not interacting with the puppy in any way, and with a human. And however, the status of the humans has been changed over the experiment. This picture just shows you how you can imagine what was going on. And what we were interested in this experiment was how much time the puppy is spending close to the dog or close to the human, whether there was any interaction between the two species. And this is the result of this experiment. And actually it looks complicated, but it's not complicated at all, because this is what we calculated with the so-called preference index. So if the preference index goes into this direction, then as you can see on the slides, I mean, that shows that the animal, which could be a wolf puppy or a dog puppy, was preferring the owner sitting on the one side, or on the other side you could have another person or a dog, and if the values go down, that would show that there's a preference towards the other partner. Now, if we analyze this in detail, you can see that this is the results for the dog puppies. So dog puppies are actually preferring the owner when the owner is sitting there with an adult dog. So if there is an owner versus another dog there, then the dog puppy is preferring the owner. However, if there are two humans, one of them is the owner, then this preference decreases. Basically, you can say that there is no preference. So for a young puppy, obviously it likes the owner, but if there's another human, it is also interesting, so the preference is is smaller for humans. Now, in the case of the wolves, you get an opposite result, or partly opposite result. Here, when you look at the owner-experimenter difference, so basically another person and the owner, then what we see is the wolves are preferring the owner. So they're preferring the new person, they're preferring the known person over the new person, suggesting that they are not so comfortable with the new people around. However, if you're looking at the owner versus dog situation in the case of the wolf puppies, then what we see here is that there's no preference, so compared to this situation, the preference decreases, which means that the wolf puppies actually spend quite a lot of time with the dog, at least the same time as they would spend with their owner. So, in summary, although the situation is not very simple, we could say that wolves have a higher preference towards dogs, or obviously probably towards wolves, but we couldn't use a wolf in this situation for a subject. And the dogs rather show a general preference for humans and a decreased preference towards dogs in that situation. I think this also shows already that there are some differences, and what you have to remember here is that we raise the wolf puppies and the dogs very much in the same way. So their experience about the social world, about everything, was very much the same. Another experiment which we did was about looking at the agonistic interaction in wolves and dogs. And as you know, one big issue is when you are sharing your life with an animal, what kind of cooperative, competitive situations you might get in. Now, this is always interesting because lots of people are talking about this human-dog relationship in terms of a dominance relationship. So, as if we would compete for the resources with our own pet dog. I mean, that's not usually the case. We have our pet dog because we want to enjoy, we want to cooperate with them rather than to compete. And I have never seen an owner who was actually competing over food with his or her dog, especially not over the dog food. Now, this is very important to understand that, okay, if a dog has a food, what is the inclination? Does he has any trend to share or at least allow the others to interact? For a wild animal, that's totally unnatural. A wild animal, even if it's a young animal, it should protect its own food because that's what he has obtained. And he should protect it even against siblings or even against their parents. Now, this is the normal thing. The question is why or whether dogs and wolves are different in this respect. So in Budapest, many years ago, we did this experiment where with our wolf puppies and dog puppies, of course, where we tried to show in a very nice way. So there was no pain or no bad situations, to find out how or whether dogs are or the wolves are protecting their food. So this experiment was done in the following way. As you will see later in the video, so the little young animal gets a piece of chicken meat. Then the experimenter is just very close to the animals, and then it's touching the animal, so basically stroking, petting the animal. Then, if it's possible, the experimenter will grab the bone or the piece of meat and in a slow and quiet way, try to get it away from the puppy. So there's no force there. We never take it away by force, rather than getting it away, and also even using some verbal cues. So something like, please give it to me, would you please release it, and so on like this. So in a very nice way. And then the question is how these two species compare in this situation. And just to show you the result first, is that basically what we see, there are many differences, by the way, in these situations between dogs and wolves, but one very important difference is the acoustic communication that we can hear and experience during this situation is the frequency of growling. Now, as you say in this figure, what it is, these are the phases of the experiment. So the first phase is when the experimenter first approaches the puppy. The second phase is then he pets the puppy, and so on and so forth, just as I explained before. So basically we are going from up to this part, and basically what we noted here on this figure is at which phase the wolf or the dog started to growl for the first time. And what you can see, the green is the wolf here. So usually wolf cubs growl in a second phase, sometimes even earlier, sometimes some puppies a little bit later. This was repeated 3 times in early ontogeny, so week 6, week 7, and these are the 8 weeks old cubs. And you see that there is not much change in the behavior, and this growling emerges readily in the wolves. What you see is what you don't see, is that the yellow pattern that is considered being the dog, there's no yellow here at all. So some individual dogs tested from 11, they might emitted some growling, but this was just one animal usually for that week, and all the other dogs were just silent. They didn't express any anger at the human by producing any sound, and growling is a typical sound of aggressive tendencies. So this is actually, and I show you now the video how it looks like from one of the wolf puppies, and you can see here the experimenter is preparing the situation. The puppy is already there watching. Now we allow the puppy to eat a little bit from this meat, that he feels safe and happy about this situation. Now the experimenter is slowly approaching the puppy according to the protocol. You can see already that the puppy is moving it away from the human, so we have to follow it. Okay, and this is what is a typical behavior, that even, you can see that it's a very tiny 5-6-week-old puppy, and it protects the food against a human, although, as you could see just a few minutes before, it is just a lovely wolf puppy when you have it in the hand and you are not giving him the opportunity to feed a piece of meat. And he's continuously growing and growing, and this is what is quite typical for the wolves, and you don't really see in dogs. And for a dog, it would be a very nice interaction with a human. Social interaction is always good for a puppy to have in some situations, and the dogs are not really tolerating that. Yes, not what we are this. Yes, so it could be quite dangerous. And that's why that's one reason why I'm showing it, that this is what you should not do at home. This is our experienced people who are dog trainers and have 10, 15 years of experience to interact with animals. I'm not saying that this can never happen in a dog puppy, maybe in some specific situations with some specific genetic background, but again, generally, this was typical for our wolf puppies and never happened with any of our dog puppies that were tested. Eventually, we will succeed to continue. So I'm just showing Zsófi has the chance to. Yes, okay. Let's finish now. So this is a typical interaction between the wolf puppy and a human. So you can see already that this kind of sharing already depends very much on the species, and already that this seems to be specific to the wolves. And I think when you consider domestication of the dogs and how these young dogs, I mean many years ago, when they were included in the human social communities, I mean that sort of behavior was not really nice. And so probably humans were selected for, those animals who didn't show so strong protective behavior, or if you would like to call it aggression, towards a human. So I think the sharing of food, and obviously the sharing of many other things like a place where you can have your rest and so on, I think this is really specific to the dogs. And obviously if a dog grows up, a dog grows up as a dog, then this behavior pattern is retained, and this is why then later so many cooperative interaction can take place between dogs and humans, and even very complicated one, like you can train a dog for a blind, or dogs that are helping disabled people. This is all probably based on this ability to share resources and cooperate rather than compete in such situations. Another experiment that we did many years ago, showing these differences in communicative interaction between the wolf and the dogs. Remember, dog and wolf puppies were raised in a similar way. There were no major difference how we raised our dog's puppies and wolf puppies for many months. And in all that, they got the same human interaction. So those wolf puppies had the same human contact, they got the same amount of petting and love, if you like, from their human owners. Now, what Marta Gacci did in this experiment was a very simple one. The puppies, like this on the picture, got a piece of food whenever they looked or gazed into her eyes. So she was sitting on the floor, the puppy was running around, and then the puppies eventually, by accident, looked in the eyes of Marta, and then they received a piece of food. Now, if you do this interaction, that what you see is that for the dog puppies, whether they were 5 weeks old or 9 weeks old, you can see this increasing frequency of looking. So by the end of a very short, if you call training session, it was 4 minutes long, it's a very short training session, you can already see that at the beginning the dog puppy might look twice per minute into the eyes of Marta, but by the end it increased to 8. Now, this is again a very rapid learning, and probably most puppies are experiencing that, and obviously most humans experiencing this, because whenever they interact, so whenever a puppy is looking at our eyes, we would say, "Oh, how clever you are," and they get some petting and social reward. And even this increases the frequency, so at the end we are ending up with dogs that sometimes sit in front of us and even look for hours in our eyes, even if it sometimes feels too much. At least, especially for me, it would be a little bit too much. Maybe this is the reason why I don't have dogs at home looking at me so long time. However, in comparison to the dogs, what we see is that in the wolves, there is no change in the behavior. The wolves might look in the human eye by accident, frequently, not so frequently, but they don't learn. Although they obtain the food, obviously, if they look, but this doesn't result in a change in the behavior. So again, I think this shows that even very early on, the communicative interaction between wolf and dogs is markedly different. This means that when a puppy is learning that looking at a human is very could be important, then he's not only learning that looking is good, but while he's looking, he can also obtain a lot of information. Dogs can look at our face to decode our emotional state. They can look at our body to find out what we are going to do. They can adjust the behavior to our future behavior in some ways. So I think just by changing, probably in a very simple way during domestication, this tendency for look, you can put the dog in a very different, if you like, social niche, because he can obtain a lot of information about the human in a very spontaneous way. This is not to say that you can not train a wolf to look. People in Vienna, in Austria, they actually did these experiments. And if you are really consistent and you go on with this training, eventually a wolf will also look in the eyes of a human. But that's not what I think usually happens. And I say never that when you compare the two species, that dogs or wolves can not be showing the same performance in some situations. It's rather the question how fast they learn to perform at a high level in one situation or the other. So for sure, when they are interacting with a human, I think, and at least in these two experiments already showed that dogs have a better chance to show high performances in such experiments. And here is the last, probably even more sort of famous result, where we tested dogs and wolves, how they react to the pointing gesture. The pointing gesture is a typically human communicative signal, and the question was obviously whether the animals are different, dogs and wolves are different when they are interacting with a human in such situations. And there were many debates, and there are still some debates going on, whether there's a difference between the two species and whether this is a difference with regard to cognitive abilities or something else. In this experiment led by Marta Gacci, we compared basically the two species, also the young ones and the older ones. And what I think is really interesting is that if you compare the two species, what you see is, yes, at an old age, or relatively old age, so I should say an adult dog and an adult socialized wolf, so both are socialized, living in a very close contact with humans. Indeed, you don't see really a difference. So both wolves and dogs are attending the pointing gesture in some way, and their performance can be said it's good, rather excellent, which other people sometimes claim. But if you are looking at the developmental aspect, then what you see here is a real difference. So here the dog puppies are showing a higher performance comparison to the wolf puppies. They are the chance. So they are not choosing the right side, whether it's left or right. They are just actually going randomly, if you see. Obviously, the reason for that could be different for them, and I think it's not based on the cognitive aspect, so it's not about understanding the gesture, how some people would put it. Rather, it's about attending. So the wolves don't spend enough time by looking at the human and finding out which way the human is pointing. They are not interested in this interaction when they are young and when they are not so much experience. Adult wolves, after long experience, yes, they learn it. But for the dogs, it's immediately when they are already 4 months old or even younger, important to have this visual contact with the human, and this can be utilized in, let's say, understanding the pointing gesture. Now, just to give you another aspect of this dog-wolf comparison is to show how they compare when they are learning socially from conspecific. And this experiment was run in Vienna by Frederica Range and Sophie Varagny, exposing both dogs and wolves to dog demonstrators. Here you can see on the pictures that this is a sort of a small problem box. Then if the dog is pushing the lever, then this raised the top, and there was some food that could be taken out from the box. So this was there were some dogs that were trained for this job to go there and do it automatically. It took them a few seconds to open. I mean, it's not such a difficult task after you've been trained. And there were some observers, both dogs and wolves who had no experience, and the only experience was that they could see another animal. In the case of the wolf, it was a dog, so it was not a conspecific, but another related animal, how they do the demonstration, and then after the demonstration they had a chance to try and open it again. Now what they found in Vienna, that in this case wolves, this is the number of successful animals who did solve the problem after watching the demonstrator, and here what was sort of maybe surprising, the wolves performed at a much higher level. So basically all the wolves could, after one observation, observe or solve the problem, and for the dogs, whether they were adults or younger ones, there was no real effect, so they could not learn from the conspecific. So this shows, I think, in a very interesting but short way, how dogs and wolves can be compared. However, we need to expose them to the same experiences, and I think what is really important and what you should remember, that whether a dog or a wolf performing in a different level depends very much on the testing context. Dogs might be better when they are tested in a social context, in an interaction with humans, while wolf might be better if they have to learn from or interact with their own species. So here I would finish for the first session on the comparison, and I think we will come back shortly talking more about comparison of breeds and comparison of individuals.